Hello, everybody. Uh, Welcome to my virtual mini course at Virtual Convention. We're going to be talking about the demise, the death of God in contemporary society. And we're going to do that by looking at T.S. Eliot's poetry. I think that the death of God is pretty much everywhere in our world. And by the death of God, I mean that there's an indifference to God. People don't talk about God. People don't think about God. Churches are dwindling. Now, Eliot wrote about all this in 1922, when churches were still rather prominent. In Eliot's poetry, he tried to capture what he called the mind of Europe. And by writing his poetry, he thought he was capturing the world of Euro-American life, the mind. Let's talk a little bit about his poetic techniques. He uses imagery, pictures, verbal pictures, to paint an image of what he's talking about. He doesn't explain things really in his poetry, but he gives you images that bring forth the ideas he wants you to know. He calls it the objective correlative. That's the big school word for what Eliot does, the objective correlative. And let's get right into his imagery talking about the death of God. We'll look at reading number 1. Perfect, there it is. All right. Reading number 1 says, in this decayed hole among the mountains, in the faint moonlight, the grass is singing over the tumbled graves about the chapel. There's the empty chapel, only the wind's home. It has no windows, and the door swings. Dry bones can harm no one. That's from The Wasteland. Empty chapel, only the wind's home. You see, what does this image bring forth in your mind? An empty chapel, no windows, the doors swinging on its hinges. And don't say it's a typical Swedenborgian church, because we're a little bit better than that. But you see, the image of an empty chapel is a way of saying churches are empty. There's no life in them. God is dead. Now, Eliot's poetry in The Wasteland, which is what we're mostly going to talk about, draws heavily on the work of Sir James Frazer and Jessie Weston. James Frazer wrote The Golden Bough, and Jessie Weston wrote From Ritual to Romance. These works vastly survey primitive religions or ancient religions, particularly for Eliot, about the fertility cycle, about the death of crops in the winter and the rejuvenation in the spring. And he drew on these texts of Sir James Frazer and Jessie Weston as kind of like background for The Wasteland. And we're going to get into how he uses these ideas in his death of God imagery by first reading something from Sir James Frazer, The Golden Bough. Okay, number 2. Yes, good. That's fine. So in The Golden Bough, Frazer writes about some of the Middle Eastern gods. And if you look at reading number 2, Frazer writes, under the names of Osiris, Tammuz, Adonis, and Attis, the peoples of Egypt and Western Asia represented the yearly decay and revival of life, especially of vegetable life, which they personified as a god who annually died and rose again from the dead. So the fertility cycle is personified as a God who dies and comes back to life. We Christians see that as Jesus' death and resurrection, but there were other gods in this area that had a similar idea. So look at number 3, and you'll see how Eliot uses this passage from the Golden Bough in a kind of a parody of the dying and resurrected God. This is from The Wasteland, reading number 3. There I saw one I knew and stopped him, crying, "Stetson, you who were with me in the ships of Mylae, that corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? Or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed? Oh, keep the dog far hence, that's friend to men, or with his nails he'll dig it up again." So you see, the dying and resurrected God becomes a corpse that Stetson planted in his garden. And Eliot is sarcastically asking, has this corpse begun to sprout? Will it bloom? So we don't get a God that dies and is resurrected. We get a corpse that's planted in a garden, stays there, and instead of resurrecting, is it going to bloom? You see how Eliot's drawing on this imagery, using it to show there isn't this living God that dies and resurrects. There's just this dead corpse. God is dead. He also uses traditional spiritual language in a kind of a parody like this, again, to show that God is dead in our culture. If we'll go on to number 4, yes, good. There's a quote from The Wasteland that references Ezekiel. Ezekiel is looking at the valley of dry bones, and God says, "Stay to the children of Israel." But look at what Eliot says in number 4. What are the roots that clutch, the branches that grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Okay, son of man is what God calls Ezekiel. And if you'll look at 4a, just below that, I've given you the passage from Ezekiel that this references. In Ezekiel, God says to Ezekiel, "Son of man, all my words that I shall speak to you, receive in your heart and hear with your ears, and go, get you to the exiles, to your people, and say to them, thus says the Lord God." Say to them, thus says the Lord your God. So Ezekiel is going to say to the people of Israel God's words. But in the wasteland, the Son of Man cannot say or guess, for he knows only a heap of broken images. God's word is dead in the wasteland, and the wasteland reflects our society. And Eliot gives us some images of what a dead society looks like. Let's scroll down to Numbers 5 and 6. We can only get 5 in without 6. This is from a different poem of Eliot's called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And in this poem, J. Alfred Prufrock goes to a series of parties, soirees, and salons. And these salons are just dead at the center. They're all ritual. There's no life in them. So look at what this man says, Prufrock, in number 5. "For I have known them all already, known them all. I have known the evenings, the mornings, the afternoons, I've measured out my life with coffee spoons. I know the voices dying with a dying fall beneath the music from a further room, so how should I presume? Yes, good. And then on number 6, he continues, listen to this. And would it have been worth it after all? After the cups, the marmalade, the tea, among the porcelain, among some talk of you and me, would it have been worthwhile to have bitten off the matter with a smile? To have squeezed the universe into a ball, to roll it towards some overwhelming question, to say, I am Lazarus, come from the dead, come back to tell you all, and I shall tell you all. If one, settling a pillow by her head, should say, that is not what I meant at all. That is not it at all. So here's Lazarus come from the dead, ready to tell them all. And the lady at the cocktail party says, that's not what I meant. This is the man that's measured out his life with coffee spoons. And we see here a society that's vacuated of all depth, of all meaning. It's just a series of social rituals. So through Eliot's poetry, he's talking about how God is dead in society. He showed it through an empty church that's the wind's home only. He showed it through the Son of Man, who cannot speak God's word. He can only know a bunch of broken images. We went to a cocktail party where a man measured out his life with coffee spoons. And when Lazarus comes from the dead, it's met with indifference, even though he could tell them all the secrets. These are the images Eliot uses. So it's up to us to think, is God dead in our society? Churches are dwindling across the board, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian churches, and across denominational lines. Now, Swedenborg says that we are now in the end of the old Christian church. And he says further that the church has to be vastated, which means essentially that the church has to completely die out before a new church can be risen up from the ashes of the old church, like Phoenix from the fire ashes. But he says something very interesting that I don't think our church has properly recognized. And that is, the new church will not come from where the old church was. The new church comes from where the church was not. That is among Gentiles. Let's look at reading number 7. Yeah, good. We can read all of them. We can keep it right there. Number 7. This is from the Arcana Celestia, or Heavenly Secrets in the New Translation. Swedenborg writes, furthermore, it should be recognized that when any church ceases to be a church, that is, when charity perishes, and a new one is established by the Lord, rarely, if ever, is this done among those with whom the old church existed. Instead, it is established among those with whom no church existed previously. No church existed previously. That is, among the Gentiles. And let's look at number 8 from Arcana Celestia, number 2910, saying essentially the same thing. When the church reaches its close and perishes, the Lord always raises up a new church somewhere else. Yet rarely, if ever, has he done so from the members of the previous church, but from the Gentiles who dwell in ignorance. Now we know in our religion that there have been 4 such churches. There was the most ancient church, which died, and then the ancient church rose up. It died, and then the Israelitist church rose up. It died, then the Christian church rose up. It died, and that's where we are now. We're in the death of the old church. Now, I know that we have new teachings, and we fancy ourselves as part of the new church. But look at our church services. They're very much like the old Christian church, Bible readings and sermons and hymns and chanting from the Psalms. We use the same Bible. So perhaps we're part of that old church movement that is now dying out, which will be replaced by the new church. Finally, we'll look at Arcana Celestia 4747, reading number 9. For this reason, when any new church is being set up by the Lord, it is not set up with those who are within the church. I think that's us. But with those who are without. That is with the Gentiles. And that's, I think, most of the world right now. So maybe what I'm giving you all is a mixed message. It's sad that churches are dwindling, and I think that's pretty clear. But it's part of this exciting new movement of a new church being raised up where the church is not. So this death of God we're seeing in society may be the fertile ground for the new church that God is preparing to raise up in our culture. And I'm going to leave you with some positive data. I did some internet research on all this, and I found some very interesting things. One of the sites I went to said that there are 168,000 Bibles sold or given away to others every day in the U.S. And in the U.S., there's 20 million Bibles sold each year. Now think about this. That's just the U.S., 20 million Bibles sold every year. And that's twice as many Bibles as was sold in the 1950s. In the 1950s, churches were booming. Now churches are dwindling, and yet there's twice as many Bibles being sold now than there were sold in the 50s. Worldwide, Bible sales are at 100 million yearly. The Bible is the world's bestseller. Maybe churches are shrinking, but Bible sales are growing. And to me, that's a very encouraging sign. Presumably, if you buy a Bible, you're going to read it. People are reading the Bible, even if they're not going to church. So, to conclude, this death of God ideology that may be permeating our society may not be as bad as it looks. Maybe this is preparing the ground for the new church, which is going to be set up outside the present church. Well, that about concludes my talk. It's kind of strange sitting here talking to my computer. I'm used to doing this in a room with all of these bodies present, but we have to make accommodations to the time we're living in. And I look forward to taking your questions when we do this live. I hope you've enjoyed my talk, And from Edmonton, Alberta, this is Pastor Dave Fekete signing off.
Hello, everyone. I'm Reverend David Brown, Director of Ministry at Wayfarers Chapel. Thank you for joining with us, Reverend Dr. David Fekete. Thank you again for the presentation. And I am going to start off with a few questions that came to us. And this one you might recognize. I'm not going to tell what their last name is, but it is Kurt F., who says, how will we recognize this new church? How will we be able to differentiate from the other new churches?
Yeah, in a way, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? Will we see anything clearly that looks like a church? Think about when Christianity was born. The Jews saw a movement arising. The Romans saw a threat to their national church, which was the classical religion. But Christianity didn't look like a church until maybe 300 years later. I think, and we don't really know what the new church is going to look like, but I think it's more going to be a movement than an organization, a consciousness. So that's what we should be looking for, maybe. But it's really, we don't know what the new church is going to look like. It won't look like us, I don't think. I can say that.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think there is some opportunity as we're kind of all together discussing these ideas, these concepts, and consciousness. There is this concept of relational consciousness, or changes in consciousness, and how do we further to evolve those. So very good. This one comes from Rosalind T., who says, do you think the organized Swedenborgian church / new church organizations are more like the former church that is quote perishing, or more like the Gentiles with new thought patterns, etc.?
Yeah, good question, Rosalind. There was a debate going on when this church was first founded. And one of the prominent writers about it was Henry James Sr. He wrote a pamphlet called The New Church, Not Another Ecclesiasticism. And Henry James Sr. saw the new church as a movement. It was Hindmarsh that decided to model the new church after the old church. And there was a big debate going on in England at that time, whether we should break away from the Church of England and start a new sect, or whether we should just let the ideas permeate society as they have. So in answer to Rosalind's question, I think that the organized Swedenborgian church is more like the former church. We're the ones calling ourselves the new church, and Henry James called us what was his French word? The soi-disant, the self-proclaimed new church. And that's what we are, the self-proclaimed new church. So I think we do Bible readings, we sing hymns, we have sermons. What's so new about that? I think we look like the old church, and as is the case with so many of our parishes, we're going the way of the old church.
Yeah, let's see. So I need to have time to type these up, but people are still asking questions. This one's a two-part question. I'll give them all three questions. Renee M says, what do you think the emerging new church will feel like, question, or look like? And it's a bit of a two-part question. I'll give you that one first.
Yeah, the fact that it's new means it will be different from us, I think. And mind you, I'm not Prince Hamlet either. I'm not a prophet. So I can't see into the future. But the new church, as I said to Kurt, will be a movement. It might be invisible. And Swedenborg does say the new church will be internal, not external. And it's funny, people I talk to that are unchurched, and we might want to get to Will's question about that, often are very receptive to the ideas I mentioned. I remember talking in a cigar bar once. The fact that I was in religion means religion always came up whenever they were talking to me. And people were really into the idea of God as divine love and wisdom. It's just when I said divine love and wisdom took a human form in Jesus that we parted company. They didn't like that idea. And
Right.
can I move on to Will's question there? Do you want to read it about the decent, godless people?
Yeah, let me find that here.
It's at the very top.
Yeah, Will L says, I was thinking of choruses from The Rock. To quote that, these were a decent, godless people.
Yeah, I think that our society now, and this gets to all those questions about the new church, is largely made up of decent, godless people. This was a real question Eliot didn't know what to do with. He said, how can there be people that are decent, good people, but have no place for religion in their lives? He couldn't understand that, and I'm not sure I do either. But I think our world, and this might be what we're seeing in the Gentiles and the new church, is these decent people that have no understanding, no need for religion in their life, and how they get by day to day without there being a higher power or a need for one, I don't know. But that, I think, is the Gentiles in which the new church will be seated.
Yeah, great. And I just this one came in from Peggy T. Says, where will we go who are already part of current church structure? Can we transform the current structure into this new church? And are they related?
You know, that gets back to the real founding of our church and why I'm a part of this organized religion. I want there to be a place for Christians where there's only one God. I want a place where personal responsibility, the good of life, is taught. And a lot of other Christians are friendly and they talk about the good of life, but and I have a real close connection with my National Council of Churches colleagues. You know, it's a good experience for me to be there. But when it comes to questions of the saints and of the Trinity, I want a place where I can feel at home. And so for that reason, I'm glad we have our organized new church, Swedenborgian church. And so I'll really miss this if the church dissolves completely. So I don't know where we'll be able to go. Maybe meeting in living rooms, which is how the early Christians began meeting, in living rooms and having meals together and talking about stories of Jesus.
Yeah, thank you for all that. I'm going to leave us with one last question, and hopefully it's encouraging for the younger generations. Also from Renee M. And speaking to our keynote speaker from last year, addressing Reverend Dr. Matthew Fox, who believes that our youth will lead us and that we must listen to them. And the question is, what do you understand them to be saying?
Yeah, realize that what I'm saying comes from a 65-year-old man about the youth. Maybe the political activism we're seeing in young people are the words of the new church, you know? We went on for years and years and centuries with structural injustice in our society. And young people are saying, you know, we're not going to have any more of it. And shame on us, old people, for not doing more about that and letting our privilege, sitting comfortable in our privilege. So maybe all the voices, there's that young Swedish woman talking about ecology. I forget her name. Maybe you remember, David.
Isn't that Greta?
Yeah, Greta. Yeah, sorry. Maybe the activism and the mobilization. I'll also say at a Parliament of World Religions, they had a meeting that was geared around young people. And they all said social issues bring people together from all different religions and no religion at all. Homelessness, feeding the hungry, ecology. So maybe that's what the new church is going to look like. People getting together to make the world a better place, to bring heaven to earth, on earth as it is in heaven. Maybe that's what the young people are saying, and maybe that's the prophetic voice of the new church among the Gentiles.
Yeah, I like all of that. That's very good and encouraging. I think that's probably a good one to conclude on in terms of leaving the hope for all of these systemic structural pieces that we're witnessing, systemic racism, the things culturally that are taking place now, recognizing and sustaining some attention on them. And certainly the youth are starting to enter into all of this a bit more forcefully with the tools that they have. So thank you, Reverend Dr. David Fekete. Any other last words you had to say to anyone?
No, I thought that wrapped it up quite well, you know, and it ended on a kind of hopeful note. The young people, and they are the future of where the world's going too. So thank you all for coming to this talk, and thank you, Dave, for moderating, and for the technical mastery down there, Nicholas. Thank you for that too.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone.